cool. Nobody uses this.
Oh, it helps to figure out what people are asking.
You think?
It does.
Oh, okay. Aha. Question for you.
Yeah.
Do you know how to make a website?
No.
Okay, then.
I'm sorry.
I thought you were a techie. Come on.
Oh, I am a techie, but that's not how the HTML markup variety.
Okay. I did it once.
I did it once in middle school.
No, I had my grandson talking me through it and creating a website, and we don't use that website, so I forgot how. And,
The most I've done is a pre-done WordPress one.
No, has
I still
to.
can't run my head around RSS.
I know. I mean, I get the domain and I get it, but somebody has to know how to tie it into the gift shop, the website.
Oh.
It's really, but it's a separate website, but paying goes into the gift shop.
I never really made it work out. I never really had to do the pay.
I never either, and I don't know. But whoever does the website here, I bet you would know how.
You mean Cece?
Whoever
She might help. Cece does.
Cece who?
Madison.
She's the one who does the website?
Yes.
I'm sure she's on the Temple website.
She is, yeah.
I'll find her. Poor thing, she doesn't know what she's in. I've written a bunch of forum skits, lyrics, everything but I don't do sound tricks.
Yeah. Soundtracks?
I don't do it. To coincide with the lyrics that I've written.
Oh, yeah. I can't write music.
It's not original music.
Oh.
It's lyrics. It's lyrics written to other tunes.
Oh, okay.
But it's getting,
I'm pretty good about that, actually.
I don't like making soundtracks because it has to be, it's not a whole song. Sometimes it's you skip a verse and you have to da-da-da-da-da, and it's like, get the sheet music, get a piano. You want to do it. In high school, back in the last century, when we did musicals, we had 2 pianos.
Yeah.
Geez, it came out great. What was didn't have drums, didn't have guitar. All we had were 2 pianos, and we were never mic'd. We learned how to project.
Yes, exactly. I grew up in elementary school music classes where the musicals didn't have mics on castle.
Where'd you go to school?
The International School of Stuttgart. My dad was serving overseas.
Okay. And that's what you went. That's a traditional dramatic way. Singing and speaking. We used to say, you've got to be heard in the first row of the balcony.
How did you have a worm in your career?
You betcha.
Yeah. Singing the nosebleeds.
You hear it. And there were no mics. We were not mic'd. Now everything is mic'd.
I hate mics.
I do too. It's just.
So it's cheating.
Well, not only that, I don't like singing in the mic because I don't know. I'm used to that as a murmur song. Yes. You can't do it. It's like, I'm going to blast everybody out to Kingdom Come. So you have to restrain. You can't use a natural way of doing it. You're restraining it. I think. At least I am.
Yes, it is. I'll tell you what. When I showed up, I was a part of this awful version of Christmas Carol. I'm this absolutely tiring guy, and even more tiring costume designer. We got a deaf sound mixer. No offense, but he was right where he was in his ear. This was in the rain, and it was he'd done it all these years, and it was kind of awkward. People would be backstage, and I was going to pick off, and
I haven't done it. I taught, but I haven't taught. I was tech director, but that's a long time ago. And it was, we did shows that you could not, in high school, you could not put on there. Because they're not PC. And they'll offend everybody. So, you don't do it. I don't know who did it. I don't have to do it anymore. It's not my problem. Yeah. Hello. How are you? I'm good, sweetie. How are you doing? Yes, you can. I have my rabies and I don't have distemper and all my shots. I know. So you're from I'm doing it not for myself. That's the thing. I'm doing it for the guys. Instead of buying them. Sell them, make some money. That's the whole point. Right. I could be taking classes online. I could be doing all kinds of things. Right. So that's the goal anyway. And then hopefully we'll get back to film and do our evening stuff because there's a lot of choices.
For 5 days.
I know. I'm waiting for choirs to come in. My voice, so I haven't. I gotta go back to taking singing exercises that I've been doing before, which I haven't done in 2 years. My voice, no, I haven't been singing. I mean, I'm not singing. I'm singing at home. That's it.
Last week was the best.
Pardon?
Last week it was the best.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, I can't.
I don't want to, hand Silver said, don't take notes, just listen. But then I'd like to get it, and I don't know how. It's not so easy.
It doesn't need its own spot. He should really practice.
I love the book. Isn't it interesting how we were lucky enough to get the right person at the right time?
Yes. He's an absolute gem. They all, Roger, I adore him.
She's right into the camera, isn't she? She's nice camera.
Not an old story.
Right. I took a course with him at the college, way back when. He sat with his parents.
Doug goes to Chicago.
They both
That's
did.
how the
David does too.
Stacy's the body.
And now Susan moved. I think it'll be very good.
Isn't that cute with the door?
Yes.
It's hard to
send
from
it to
Sarasota in this winter.
Yeah, but to be with the boy, she has that family.
So, you know, oh my God, I'm gonna have this meeting. And
She
the silence is like idle.
She plays it very tough. Douglas said she is not so tough.
What does Doug do?
Hi, Helga. I'm good. How are you?
Good morning.
Good
I
morning.
think, yes.
It's still morning.
Yes.
Unless you've been up all night, and then it could be the afternoon. If you
Yeah, I've done that too. When I get up very early, I do on occasion.
They roped off the front. Okay. Can you sit? Yeah.
Right down to time.
I'm glad you're
I
here.
wonder why I
Well,
The front one's roped off too.
how are you?
camera works fine, Lord. It really does.
Never seen him do that. Even when I'm sitting up there. Usually in the front.
Look at who's here. How are you doing? Okay. Okay. Hello. How are you? I saw Eva coming in.
Yeah, she exactly. I told her I was here, so she, she needed to miss me for a minute.
How wonderful. I'm sorry? I look like a teenager.
You have the mind of a wise man.
Well, I have to tell you, I haven't heard that in a long time, so I take it. Thank you.
Feel good on a cold day.
It would feel good. That's right. Well, it's 11 o'clock, and we are going to start. And for those of you who are able to, I encourage you to take Hebrew Bibles that are on the cart there, because we're going to use them a little bit today. And today we are going to complete, really, and to try to wrap up our study, our very introductory study of Lamentations. We've been taking 3-4 sessions at a time on each scroll in order. We started with the Song of Songs, and we moved on to Ruth, and now we've been doing Lamentations. And really, this is the 4th session that we're doing on Lamentations, and we need to move forward. This, as you understand, is no way to do justice to any of our scrolls. We really, each one of these scrolls could take so much more by way of a study. But I'm trying to communicate the message that these scrolls are a very special corpus. They're very, very special material. And not only are they very special material, if we truly understand them, we, at the end of the day, come to read the rest of the Hebrew Bible in their light. And in that respect, it's extraordinarily special. So that's what we're talking about. And beyond these scrolls being so special, beyond them being a very particular corpus and a unique corpus through which we can read the rest of the Hebrew Bible, we've made the case that they really speak to our life cycle. Each and every scroll to a different moment in life and to different needs that we have in our lives. And that the Scroll of Lamentations really speaks very profoundly to our experience of loss and how we cope and how we continue to live in the context of loss. And we've spoken about this. Today we're going to try to wrap this up. And it's very difficult to wrap this up. Those of you who are home and who are joining us or wherever you are, welcome. And thank you for being with us, and thank you for all of you being here. In a moment, we're going to truly start. This time, following comments that I've received from many people at home, I'm going to request that those of you who are here who have questions use the mic so that the people at home can hear the questions that you're raising. Otherwise, I will repeat the questions that you're raising. And I also want to say, right before we start, it's wonderful to see a few more people here, and next week we are starting to mandate vaccinations, which means that the people coming here we're going to ask that everybody be vaccinated and have proof of vaccination. You can send to us proof of vaccination in advance, or come with proof of vaccination. we're going to be able to come here and to be together. We're going to be able to lift the 50% restrictions for bigger events in terms of attendance, and we're also going to be able to have some food and drink. So when we are here, we're going to be masked. And when we eat and drink food outside, because we don't bring food and drink into the chapel, but we're going to do that in the lobby right outside on a couple of occasions and chat and so on and so forth. And we're going to talk about how we do this. But as we do this, we're going to take off our masks while we eat and drink. And then when we're here, we're going to be masked. Okay? So another step towards normalcy and towards community, and I think that's wonderful. I think it's a great prospect for us. So let's try to wrap all of this up in terms of the Scroll of Lamentations and start to think about what's going to come up next. Okay? And let me start again with a brief review, and then we're going to continue on with our material. I'm going to remind you of some of what we did. We're going to continue on with our material. And then today's session, again, is going to be more conversational. I'm going to rely on you to ask questions and to make comments as we go. And for those of you, and we're going to make this much more formal starting next week, those of you who wish to, you may email me at jcohen@ttti.org and ask questions during the sessions or make comments during the session. This is on silent. My phone is on silent, but it's here. And on the two occasions wherein I address questions, in the middle and at the end of the session, I will request a moment from everyone here. I will look at my phone, see whether you have made any comments or asked any questions, and I will address your questions as well, so that you know that you may make comments or ask questions during the session as well. Let's start. Is that okay? Shall we? Is that okay? So let's talk about the scrolls, the 5 scrolls, and our understanding of the place of the Scroll of Lamentations among the scrolls. The Scroll of Lamentations, from a chronological perspective, is the third that we read. The Song of Songs we read on Passover. Ruth we read on Shavuot. Lamentations we read on Tisha B'Av. So it's the third that we read. The Song of Songs is about love and about youth and about the natural world and the power of the natural world to lead us forward, and the ongoing power of life, right? The Scroll of Ruth, as we have seen, is about covenant and family and support networks, and how families functioning well and correctly can help us through tragedy, through loss, and can offer us hope into the future. And Lamentations is about the experience of loss, not only personally, but also collectively. And we're going to talk about this. And today we're going to really try to tie these loose ends together. How the collective experience of loss, think about this in terms of our lived experience within the last 3-4 generations as the Jewish people. The collective experience of loss is also deeply personal. Right? There is an element of it that is collective, that we can all relate to, that is part of our collective memory to a certain degree, even for those of us who are second generation who haven't lived through the Holocaust. There is a collective perception, understanding of the Holocaust that is lived through our experience of those who have lived through it, right? And collective memory is a big issue that we're not going to talk about today, right? How can collective memory even exist, right? There's something that is collective about this, and we can speak to as a collective, and we have a responsibility to speak to as a collective, and at the same time, no two stories are the same. The personal experience of the tragedy, the personal experience of the loss, are individual in ways that cannot be transcended, cannot be understood by those of us who were not there. Right? And you have that collective and the deeply personal, deeply individual. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about how this functions. Right? So, first of all, we are recalling the role of the Scroll of Lamentations and its place among the scrolls. And it's leading us to a place of resilience. It's leading us to a place of hope. It's leading us to a place of the ability to live, to continue with our lives altered, changed, because our lives are never going to be the same. And we're going to talk about the collective, historical, political on the one hand, and personal on the other. And then we have to understand ourselves also theologically, spiritually. This is what we're getting to today. It isn't only that we are changed by loss. It isn't only that we are changed by tragedy. It is that the world is changed in our eyes. It is that our approach to the world, our way of seeing the world and interacting with the world, with everyone around us, changes. It isn't just about us. It is about us and the world around us. And this is something we have to talk about today, and this is part of us tying together these loose ends. And we talked about all of these things happening at the same time. We started introducing these themes and saying we must have a way to find hope. We must have a way to find strength. We must have a way to think these things through and to find a way forward. And we're going to talk about this, and not only are we going to talk about this, we're going to talk about this in the context of, trying to conclude these sessions, trying to conclude these particular ideas that are associated with the Scroll of Lamentations and leading us forward to the next scroll that we're going to be looking at, which is a remarkable text, the Scroll of Ecclesiastes, which I dare say, I am going to suspect, I'm going to assume, very few people have really read carefully here among us. Some might have, but most people don't study the Scroll of Ecclesiastes, right? So this is where we're going. Are you ready? Yes? Does this sound familiar? Does this? Okay. Here is the question. The question is, how do we look into the world and into our future, given everything that we have spoken about, understanding that we are looking into the unknown? That is the question. It's not only a question of inner resilience, inner hope, and inner striving for life. It is a question of the way we approach the world and we approach our future in the world, knowing that it is unknown, knowing that it is shrouded in doubt, knowing and understanding that it is a mystery. Right? That is the question. Yes? That is the question with a capital Q that the Scroll of Lamentations comes to start to offer an answer to. And this is the question that defines the Jewish tradition. The question and the answer to the question in the way that we offer it, make us Jews. That is it. This is the one question that is definitive of who we are. Every human being has a striving for life. Every human being experiences loss. Every human being somehow experiences relationship, whether it is family or other relationship, that is meaningful. Every human being has the capacity for it. All of these things that we're talking about are in many ways universal. The unique response to this question is the core of Judaism. This, we're now getting to the deep core of Judaism. This is what we're talking about today. So we're going to do this, as always, in a kind of comparative way and explain it and start to introduce it. We're not going to answer it fully, but we're going to make real progress. Okay? Here is where we left off last time. You will recognize this from the 3rd chapter of the book of Lamentations. This I respond to my own heart, thus I hope. Right? This is my own speaking to myself. Right? This is verse 21. The loving kindness, the mercy, rachamim, right? The timeless, we have a play here with chesed and rachamim in the Hebrew text. I'm not going to go into it. The loving kindness of the timeless essence of life, in other words, of God, has not ended. God's mercies, rachamim, are not spent. They are renewed every morning, we read here. Ample is your trust, emunatecha, right? Emet and amen, right? Emunah, in effectively one word. God, life, right? The essence of life, past, present, and future, is my portion. I say with full heart, therefore I hope in it. It comes from me. I must say this to myself. This is what I must assert for myself in the face of loss, right? God is good to those who trust in God, to the soul that seeks God, the good, right? And here is the conclusion. Good, goodness, good with a capital G, the good, tov, the good in Hebrew, right? Hope, right? Which the Hebrew word for it is tochelet, right? But hope, mission, it's not just hope. It's a sense of hope and mission. It's a sense of purpose, a sense of aim, right? And silence, duma, right? Silence, yes? These are the three words here. Good, hope, mission, and silence. In other words, humility, being able to be self-contained through this. Hanging on to the personal and the individual toward the eventual redemption of God. In the hope, in the anticipation, in faith that eventually there's going to be redemption. Right? But this is me speaking to myself in the face of the unknown. Yes? Okay? What are we talking about? What hope in redemption are we talking about? What are we talking about? What are we asking ourselves? What are we saying to ourselves? What is this about? Here comes the fleshing of this out. It is good for a person when young to bear a yoke. Look at this language. Oh, I must be suffering for a purpose. There must be a purpose for it. This is, by the way, a very dangerous road to take. This is deeply problematic. There are many challenges to this. Oh, there must be a reason for this. It must be somehow purposeful. So there is a positive to this and there's a negative to this, right? There's a danger to this and there is value and insight in this. In other words, the insight, the understanding here is my loss, my way of coping with a loss, my experience of loss, my tragedy, my sadness, these setbacks, and the terrible setback that I have suffered, and the way I have addressed it, the way I deal with it, teach me something about myself. They shed light on me. They lead me to greater understanding of myself and the way I interact with the world. They teach me something. They are here to flesh something out for me. But there is a question of, is there a greater purpose beyond the fact that it's happened to me and my learning about myself through this process, which is entering into a complicated path here. We're entering into complicated territory here, which I'm not going to fully flesh out, but most of you can imagine. You can understand what I'm saying here, right? Let the person sit alone and be quiet. In other words, retract. We must retract, right? We must retract. And the book of Proverbs, and I could quote a whole number of other citations of the need to retract. There's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent, right? There's the whole notion of we must sit back, we must retract, we must be silent when God lays God's burden upon us. In other words, we must do the work on ourselves. We must understand what it is that we're going through. We must come to terms with it. We can't go around telling ourselves stories. No, it's not happening. No, this isn't real. Oh, tomorrow it will be gone. No, we have to come to terms with it. And we have to learn ourselves through this. Yes? Okay? And let us put our mouths to the dust. In other words, it is ugly, it is painful, it is deeply unpleasant. It is like eating dust. It's like eating earth. This is what we have to live through right now. This is what we have to do right now, because there may yet be hope. And where is the hope? It is in us going through this journey. If we don't do this, if we don't allow ourselves the opportunity to live through this, to truly mourn, to truly understand how we ourselves cope with this, to truly be reflective about this, right? This is the prescription. Yes, you see this? You understand what in other words, there is an order here, right? There is some value to this, and be careful with the value, but there is some value to this. We have to understand this is it right now, this is what we're doing, and we have to go through this right now, and we have to understand this is our time to live through this, and then there may yet be hope. And then, let the person, in Hebrew it's the man, but of course, I translate these things differently. Let the person offer her or his cheek to the smiter. Let her or him be surfeited with derision. In other words, don't pretend that things are better than they are. Don't pretend that things are better than they are. Understand, this is what it is. When we are defeated, we are defeated. Yes? Very tough language. Very, very difficult. Right? But very real. Very real. Yes? Now, why do we look at this from a comparative perspective? Why is it so important for us to understand ourselves in the context of others? This ought to sound familiar. Let us offer our cheek to the smiter ought to sound familiar. And it ought to sound familiar to those of us who know from the Sermon on the Mount, from the teachings of Jesus as they appear in the Gospels. Remember? Offering the other cheek? Yes? Was that invented somewhere? No. It comes from the book of Lamentations, right? Where does it come from? It comes from our tradition. I want you to understand how it's framed, and I want you to understand the innovation in a certain way of Mark chapter 5, of that place in the Gospels. We're going to look into that. We're going to talk about that for a moment and return to our Lamentations and return to understand what this means for us. You ready? Okay. Here we go. Mark chapter 5. What we have here is a counter-narrative, and it's a counter-narrative to Jewish teaching. And the entire chapter is formulated in, you have learned this, but I tell you that. You have heard this, but now take into heart that. In other words, everything that is presented here is an A but B, right? You know this, now I'm teaching you that, right? And this is the way a particular brand of Judaism is understood. We're going to see that it's not quite so simple, but again, there's so much to look into here, and I'm trying to make sense of this. Forgive me for being a little bit superficial about this. It's, you're learning this, you know this, you've heard this, but I'm telling you something else. Yes? Here in the book of Mark. Yeah.
Does it tend to be contradictory or supportive?
So the question is, and let's please, I'm going to ask that we use the microphone. The question is it contradictory or does it support the but? Is it contradictory or does it support the... It seems to be contradictory at first blush. We're going to see it's not quite so contradictory and so new, right? That's part of what we're going to see. It's more complicated than meets the eye, right? So I'm going to offer a little bit of background. This is Mark, and you can read the entire chapter. It's magnificent literature. It's beautiful literature. I'm starting here in verse 33. You have heard it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, right? Don't take an oath and break it. Don't do that. An oath is important. The vow is important. Our words are important. Do not break it. But I tell you, don't swear at all. Don't take an oath. It is so important. Not only don't take an oath and break it, don't take an oath at all. Do not swear at all. In other words, the requirements of the law are not to make an oath and to break the oath. That's the law. That's the mitzvot. These are the halakha. This is the line of the law. I tell you, we are going to be more stringent than that. You don't make an oath at all, right? That was what you learned, right? Again, when you look into the Jewish writings, in the biblical writings, other writings, they also say, avoid making oaths, but it doesn't matter. This is how it's presented here, right? Don't take an oath at all. Don't swear, and do not swear either by heaven, God's throne, the earth, God's footstool. It says here, his. I should have fixed that. God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, the city of the great king. Say yes or no, right? In other words, we are going to be more stringent. We're going to be more stringent than the requirements of the law, right? You see how it's structured. You see how this functions. Right? You have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Right? Parashat Mishpatim, the Mishpatim Torah portion in the book of Exodus. Right? Exodus chapters 21, 22, right? All this entire, right? Parashat Mishpatim of the book of Exodus. I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek also, right? Where does this come from? Now we know where the thinking comes from, right? It's a reference. It's a direct reference. to the Scroll of Lamentations. Anyone wants to sue or afflict you, take your shirt, you hand over your coat as well, right? If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, you go with them 2 miles. In other words, people are afflicting you, you go with them, you go the extra mile. It's not just a matter of recognizing that you're afflicted. It's not just a matter of recognizing that you're defeated. It's you go with them the extra mile is the way it's presented here in Mark. Yes? You see what is happening here? You have learned this. I am telling you that. We're going to go beyond that. Is it supportive of our literature or is it contradictory of it? It's a little bit complicated to say, right? It's a little bit challenging to say. But we are going beyond the requirements. Here, Christianity offers us, in this respect, a vision that is holier, if you like, more demanding, more, in a sense, stringent than Judaism. Yes? In the way that Judaism is presented here. Whether that is the case or not, and how exactly, I'm not going to go into, that's the purpose of the text, right? It's actually much more complicated than this, but that's the purpose of the text, right? You've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, right? In the New International Version, in the NIV of the Gospels. Not quite so simple. Ahavta lere'acha kamocha. The word re'acha has been often commented on by the rabbis. The word re'a means friend, but reish ain also means evil, which means a legitimate interpretation of that word re'acha could also mean your enemy, your evil, your right. So there's a whole, there's a whole question about that. It says, love your neighbor. I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your parent in heaven, your Father in heaven. God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you only love those who you love, who love you, then you're just like everybody else, right? We're like the pagans. We're like everybody else, right? How is it that you become holy? By loving everybody, including those who are your enemies, including those who persecute you, right? If you're only caring for those who are in your circle, what's so special about you? Be perfect like your heavenly parent, your heavenly Father is perfect. Here in the NIV, in the New International Version of the Gospel. Do you see what's happening here? Do you see what's going on here? There's a universalization of these rules of Judaism in the way that they're presented here, which of course is a little bit more complicated than what's presented. I don't have the time to go into great detail about this, but you have learned this. I'm asking you to do that, go above and beyond of what you've learned so that you can really be perfect. This is the path we offer to you through Christianity, right? And offer your cheek, offer the other cheek, is kind of core to this, right? You see what is happening here. You see the references to the Hebrew Bible coming in. We're going to see a few other references coming in as well. Is everybody still with me? Do you see what's happening? Do you see what Mark does on the basis of our biblical text? And by the way, we could spend a huge amount of time looking at just the biblical references of chapter 5 of Mark. It would take us somewhere between 4 and 4.5 hours to go through chapter 5 of Mark. It's really because there are more than a dozen biblical references that are very clear, and we can see what he does with every single one, what the author of Mark, the redactor of Mark does. Okay, we're back to Lamentations. Take a look at this. God does not reject forever, but first afflicts, then expresses mercy in God's abundant mercies. God does not willfully bring grief or affliction to any person, crushing under God's feet all the prisoners of the earth to deny a person her or his rights in the presence of the Most High. It cannot be. We cannot believe this. It cannot be. If God did that, we would not be able to believe in God. If this is the God that is out there, we wouldn't be able to live with it. Right? We cannot conceive, we will not tolerate a God that simply brings grief or affliction to any person. We can't accept it. It cannot be. It cannot be that God will crush under God's feet the prisoners of the earth to deny people their rights in the presence of the Most High, to wrong people in their cause. This cannot be. We cannot accept it. God cannot do this. How could we say that any decree was ever fulfilled and ever realized in the world without God? How could we imagine that? Right? And the question is, in that case, how do we explain the world? How do we explain the world? Look around you. How do we explain the world around us? We cannot accept what is happening in the world, and the notion that somehow it is tolerated by God, and that the suffering and the pain and the affliction and the trampling of people's rights are somehow part of a divine plan. It is inconceivable for us. Why do innocent people suffer? Why do people have their rights trampled? How is it possible? We cannot accept that any decree was ever fulfilled, right? And we come to ask ourselves the question, is it not from the mouth of the Most High, not the moth, but the mouth, forgive me, of the Most High, that both woe and good befall? Wait a minute. Maybe God is the source of goodness and of life and of our striving for life and of the ill and of the terrible and of the awful and the intolerable. Is it conceivable that God is the source of both? How could it be otherwise? And if it is the case, how can it be tolerable? Look at the extraordinary question that Lamentations asks. Now, look again at Mark, right? Look at what Mark here says, right? What does God do? God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous, right? Where does this come from? Where does this come from? The book of Lamentations. The book of Lamentations, right? This notion, right? That it is not from the mouth, is it not from the... But here it comes as a rebellious question, as a deep question, a deep statement of affront in the face of God. How can this be? How do we make sense of this? Yes? Bear with me 1 second. I need to do a little bit more, and then I'll pause and take questions. Do you understand what we're asking? We're asking perhaps the single most profound question that we all have to deal with. Right? And the response is, we don't know. What can we do? What can we do? We only see what we see. We don't know. Let us search our paths and probe, lachakor, in Hebrew, cheker, right? To probe, to investigate, to research. I mean, to delve deeply, systematically, right? Let us lift our hearts and our hands to God in heaven. What choice do we have? It's not that we don't ask the question. It's not that we don't recognize the world we live in. It's not that we turn our gaze. It's not that we deny our own feelings. It is that we don't know. And the question is, how do we move forward? Right? It raises enormous theological, spiritual questions for us. Is there a redemption? Does the arc of history bend towards justice? Are we ever going to get there? Are we going to be okay? I don't know. I don't know. But I know what I can do. I must continue to live. I must be responsible for my own actions. I must be able to reflect upon my life and my actions. And I must hold on to some hope. This is our unique gift to the world. Okay? Okay, let's pause here for a moment and take questions. I know there were a few questions. Can we try to use the mic? I appreciate it. I just don't want to come too close because I'm not wearing a mask.
Are we to believe that it is intentional on the part of God, or that it is, is the Jewish belief that it is intentional, or that it is sort of haphazard? Our Jewish belief is right now that it is inconceivable that all the terrible things that are happening in the world could happen without the oversight or acceptance or understanding of God, because if God is omnipotent and omniscient, right, then it cannot be that God either doesn't know or doesn't approve, on the one hand, and on the other hand, that it is inconceivable and intolerable for us that God would not stand for justice, that God would trample the innocent, that God would trample the prisoners, that God would deny people's rights, and that we're having trouble reconciling the two. Therein lies the conflict.
The question is now what? Now what? That is the question of Eicha, of the Scroll of Lamentations. This is it. We have arrived. Right? And we have to be honest, we have to be clear, and we're going to talk about this in a moment in the most extraordinary way that you will see how we, through the Scroll of Lamentations and other biblical texts, say, we don't know. Unlike other faiths that say, hang on to us, we promise redemption. Hold on to us. We will get you through this. We will conquer death. We can do this. There is redemption on the other side. And the Jewish redactor, by this time the proto-Jewish, very close to Jewish, the Jewish redactor of the Hebrew Bible, the redactors say, we don't know. We don't know. Yes, Margie.
Just a quick comment and question. What you've said reminds me of Elie Wiesel's statement that we're a community of shared questions more than shared answers. And I'm wondering whether the notion of the biblical God, who is clearly directing events and including the exile and Nebuchadnezzar being a rod of his anger, over time, did the rabbis change their thinking about what is God?
Hang on to that question. How do the rabbis deal with it? Hang on to the question. This is the biblical experience. The biblical experience here in late antiquity, towards late antiquity, not quite late antiquity, towards late antiquity, in the last few centuries before the Common Era, after the expulsion, after the exile, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the experience of the tremendous suffering, the killing, the taking prisoners, what we are seeing about the nation of Israel, which was larger than Judah, that disappears completely. After all of this, they're saying, wait a minute. How do we make sense of this? And these are the shared questions. And there isn't a willingness and there isn't a commitment here to turn to simple and to superficial and to simplistic, to not just simple but simplistic answers. We're not willing to go down that road. We're not willing to go there. We're not willing to go there. Okay? I'm a little bit pressed for time. Let me ask anyone else, are there any other questions here? Yes, go ahead, Ellen.
How does free will factor into what we just read?
Where is that? How does free will factor into everything that we have read? Where is free will? Here. This is the free will. I say to my soul, I say to my heart, is the act of free will. Let me search my ways, reflect on my actions, and probe and investigate. This is an act of free will. Let me lift my heart and my hands to the heavens. This is free will. Here is free will. In other words, it's not just what happens to me, now it's about me. Here is the free will. We have a choice. Right? Forgive me for answering it in such a superficial way, because that could be an entire semester. Where is free will? The question of free will in the biblical and the rabbinic writings, we could talk about this for a very long time. But here, for the time being, even here, free will is not absent. Even here. Right? This is our choice. Yes? So what do we make of the tragedies that we have witnessed and that we have lived through? The horrific, really, historically, through the history of humankind, unique tragedies that we have witnessed. What do we make of this? Right? Okay, now here comes the really extraordinary learning that we gather through the Scroll of Eicha. Okay? I want you to see this, and I want you to understand, and I want you to understand how we and now the rabbis are starting to deal with this. Okay? I'm going to try to go through this quickly. The very end of Lamentations. This is the very end of the Scroll of Lamentations, chapter 5 of the Scroll of Lamentations. And the author says at the very end, the redactor says at the very end, "O God, you're enthroned forever, and your throne endures through the ages." The through the ages is lador vador, is the language, right? Kisacha lador vador. Why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Look at the question. Why have you forgotten us utterly and forsaken us for all time? And then, take us back to you, God, and let us return. Renew our days as of old. What is that verse? Does anyone recognize the verse? Hashiva Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Right? Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. What is this? What is this language? It's the language of our liturgy from the Torah service. We take out the Torah, right? This is where the verse comes from. Why have you forsaken us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Right? This is our reality. Take us back to you, God. Renew our days as of old, when the temple existed, when Jerusalem, renew our days as of old. This romantic view of what had been, right? Renew, take us back, right? Is the hope, right? Is not, we're not blind to having been forsaken. It's both and, yes? The reality and the hope. But how does the Scroll of Lamentations end? What's the very last verse of the Scroll of Lamentations? Unless truly, im ki, unless truly you have rejected us, you, God, have raged against us bitterly. This is how the Scroll of Lamentations ends. With an unless. In other words, do we know? We don't know. There's a question mark. Im ki. We don't know. The rabbis look at this text and they say, we can't live with this. What do you mean? How does the Bible leave us? Do you know what the rabbis do? The rabbis take this verse, take us back to you, God, let us return, renew our days as of old, and they put it, they reprint it at the very end of the chapter in small font. What are the rabbis telling us? We cannot live with this being the last word. We must go back to the hope that you, God, will take us back, that you will renew our days as of old. Look at this. I want to show this to you. I want you to have a sense here of what this looks like. I want to show everyone what, here at least, what this is. I have the page open. Take a look at this. You will see at the bottom of the paragraph, of the printed paragraph, the large font letters, and at the very bottom of the large font letters, another set of letters in smaller font. That's the penultimate verse reprinted. In other words, the rabbis are not saying, we're going to just pretend that this is part of the biblical text and that this was how the Bible left us. They're saying, no, we recognize the biblical text, but we're going to repeat the last verse because we need it, right? The rabbis are not altering the biblical text, but they are not able to leave it as it is. Yes? Take a look at this. I just want you to see this. Here. Okay, and pass this around so that you can truly see this. It's remarkable. And I want you to know it's not the only place in the Hebrew Bible where this happens. Not the only place in the Hebrew Bible where this happens. Take a look at this. Malachi, the very last prophet of the what so-called minor prophets, the 12 minor prophets. The day of judgment is at hand, burning like an oven. All the arrogant, all the doers of evil shall be straw.
That day is coming, it shall burn them to the ashes and leave them to neither stock nor bows. But for those who revere my name, a son of victory shall rise to bring healing. You shall go forth and stamp like stall-fed calves. You shall trample the wicked to a pulp, for they shall be dust beneath your feet on the day that I am preparing, said the God of heavens. A day of judgment is coming. The righteous will prevail. We have to believe in this, right? The evildoers shall perish. They shall burn. They shall be destroyed. Yes, we have to believe in that. This is Malachi, right? An older prophet. But really extraordinary. Really, I mean, look at the language here. We must believe in that. Now, who are we? What camp are we in? Are we going to be among the righteous, or are we going to be among the evildoers? Are we going to survive, or are we going to perish? How do you know? We're going to survive. How do we know? Do we know? We hope. We hope, right? We hope. We hope. Here is Malachi. Be mindful of the teaching of my servant Moses, whom I charged at Horeb, with laws and rules for all Israel. I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the coming of the awesome, fearful day of God. This is the myth, the idea of Elijah being the announcer of redemption, the announcer of the day of judgment, right here in the prophet Malachi. This is why we have a cup for Elijah at the Seder. This is why we mention Elijah at the Havdalah, right? This is where it comes from. The last chapter of Malachi. This is it, right? Elijah shall restore the hearts of parents to reconcile, parents to the children, parents to reconcile with children, and the hearts of children to their parents. Look, this is one of the most beautiful verses in the whole of the Hebrew Bible. What is the image here? Not just of healing, but of intergenerational. We are going to restore ourselves to each other. And the focus is going to be parents and children. I mean, this is, I'm going to let you bask in this. But for lack of time, I'm not going to go into them. Lest, when I come, I strike the whole land with utter destruction. If this does not happen, I will strike the whole land with utter destruction. Do we know everything is going to end well? Is it clear that everything is going to be okay? What do the rabbis do? They repeat the penultimate verse at the end of the book of Malachi. Elijah shall restore the hearts of parents to reconcile with children, and the hearts of children to their parents. We cannot live with this unknown. We cannot live like this. It cannot be. We have to hope. We must hope. The rabbis again write this in small font at the end of the book of Malachi. Do you see what is happening here? Right? Again and again in the Hebrew Bible. Do we have a response? We don't have a response. Right? But we have to somehow live. The rabbis are saying we have to somehow live. Right? Look at what is happening here. One more example. Actually, two more examples. Two more examples. The book of Isaiah. For those of you who don't know Isaiah, the end of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 66, this magnificent chapter. Please read Isaiah chapter 66. For those of you who don't know it, please read it. It is so much of what we are about. It's a remarkable chapter. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you, says God. You shall find comfort in Jerusalem. You shall see, and your heart shall rejoice. Your limbs shall flourish like grass. The power of God shall be revealed on behalf of God's servants. But God shall rage against God's foes. God is coming with fire. God's chariots are like a whirlwind to vent anger and fury, rebuke in flaming fire. For many shall be slain by or through the power of God. Right? You see again the dualism here? You see this?
taking place? I'm sorry? Now, those who sanctify, look at this. Those who sanctify and purify themselves to enter the groves, imitating the one in the center, imitating God. Those who sanctify themselves, imitating God in the center, and then, after they've done that, they eat the flesh of the swine, the reptile, the mouse. In other words, they eat all this unclean food. They don't care what they consume. You know, for a moment here, they were spiritually uplifted and they were at one with God. But then we do our own shopping and we buy our own things and we continue on our own as if, our purity and our spirituality are one part of our lives. Other parts of our lives are untouched, right? They shall come to an end, declares God, for I know their deeds and purposes. Now comes the key. The time has come to gather all the nations and tongues. Oh, you thought this was all about you. No. Remember Mark? Remember Mark chapter 5? This time has come to gather all the nations and tongues. They shall come and behold my glory. I will set a sign among them and send from them survivors to the nations. I will send people to Tarshish, to Pul, to Lud, to draw the bow, to Tubal, in other words, to India, to Persia, to the islands outside Africa, off Africa, to the islands of the Mediterranean, to Greece, Asia Minor, right? People who have never heard my fame nor beheld my glory, they shall declare my glory among these nations. And out of these nations, out of all of these people who now hear my glory, not just you, everybody, the whole of humankind, they shall bring all your brothers and horses, chariots, and mules, and Jerusalem, just as the Israelites bring an offering in a pure vessel to the house of God. All of them will come and worship. This is a universal message. It's not just for us. You think Mark invented the universalism of? No, this is Isaiah, right? Yes, you see this? This is Isaiah, and more than that, from them I will take some to be priests and Levites. You think that this is all about you, the descendants of Jacob, you, the descendants of Israel? No, it's about the way we live our lives. The message is open to absolutely everyone. This is the Jewish message. This is the Hebrew Bible. This is what we are about, right? Now, that will be a new day. Everything will be new. As look at this, the new heaven and the new earth which I will make shall endure by my will, so shall your seed and your name endure. Those of you who are living a life of goodness, living a life of righteousness, who are willing to bring the message of sanctity and of goodness, not just into one part of your lives, but to integrate it into your lives, your name shall endure, right? And all flesh shall come to worship me. Yes? Does that sound good? But all this flesh that comes to worship me, what will happen to them? They shall be forced to gaze on the corpses of those who rebelled against me, against God. Their worms shall not die, nor their fires be quenched. They shall be a horror to all flesh. This is the last verse of the book of Isaiah. The pain, the affliction, the horror will always be here with us. This is the end of the book of Isaiah. Look at this. And the rabbis look at this and say, we cannot do this. We cannot leave Isaiah as it is. We cannot leave the prophet Isaiah and cannot end like this. What are we doing? We're going to reproduce the penultimate verse in small font, yet again, a new moon after new moon after new moon, and Sabbath after Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship me. This cannot be the last word. Do you understand what is happening here? Do you see how the rabbis are reacting to this text, right? The biblical text is saying there will be no end. We cannot promise an end. We have to be honest. We have to be truthful. We don't know. We must hope, we must pray, we must have faith, but we cannot lie, we cannot deceive. We know from our experience, this is not just, it's not going to all be roses and unicorns. And the rabbis are saying, we can't do this. We can't end these, we cannot end these teachings on these notes. It cannot happen. We cannot allow this to happen. We have to somehow transcend. We have to move forward. Give me one more moment. Ecclesiastes. I have to end with Ecclesiastes because the next scroll that we're going to be reading is the Scroll of Ecclesiastes, which we read over Sukkot, as we're going to see starting next week. At the end of the day, the bottom line, the sum of the matter, right? Sof davar. When all is said and done, revere God and observe God's commandments. For this applies to all humankind. All of humankind. For God in judgment will call every creature to account for everything known and unknown, be it good or bad. Right? So, when all is said and done, revere God and observe God's commandments, for this applies to everybody. But what will happen at the end? There will be judgment. And what will the judgment be for? The good and the bad. And can I promise you anything? No. Do you know? Do I know where you're going to land? Do I know where I'm going to land? No. This is the end, good and bad, is the end of the book of Ecclesiastes. How does the book of Ecclesiastes end? Bad. And what do the rabbis say? No. What are we going to do? What are we, the rabbis, going to do? We're going to reproduce the sum of the matter when all is said and done, revere God, observe God's commandments. This is the last thing we have to have on our mind. We're going to take the penultimate verse and reprint it. And that's how we're going to end it. We have to. We have to. You see how the biblical redaction gives way to the rabbinic view of the world here, right? The rabbis are saying, we're human beings. This is too much for us to bear. We're not going to be able to tolerate this, right? Now, we're going to go back to the book of Lamentations. The last word has to be the book of Lamentations. Now we understand what is going on here. God represents eternity. God represents transcendence through time. God represents being in a way that we cannot even conceive of. And we have lived through the experience of being forsaken. We have lived through the experience of being forgotten. We have lived through the experience of being afflicted. We are not going to pretend, we're not going to say that there is justice to this, because there is no justice that we can perceive in 1.5 million children being killed in the Holocaust because they were Jewish. No one can explain the justice of this. No one can explain the justice of killing children, whether it is in China or in Rwanda, or this is beyond comprehension. Not only is it beyond comprehension, it is beyond justification. There is no way for us to somehow stand up and justify this. We have been forgotten, we have been afflicted, we have been forsaken. What can we do? We can pray. Take us back to you, God, and let us return. First of all, God, let us feel your presence, and then let us return. We need to feel something, and we want to return. We want there to be a renewal of the two-way relationship that characterizes the transcendent and the eternal and us. This is what we're asking for. And we're asking for a renewal of our days. We're asking for a regeneration. We're asking not only for growth, but for a return, for a growth that will be reminiscent of what was. Because we can only make sense of our lives, of our experiences, in the context of what we know, in the context of what was. How do we make sense of our lives? How do we understand what happens to us? How do we understand our relationships and interactions? Through patterns, through connecting the dots. In other words, by necessity, through a reflection upon our past. Renew our days as of old. Here, there is of course a possibility that this will not materialize. We know that there is a possibility that this will not materialize. We intellectually understand it. We don't know. We don't know. But the rabbis say, here are the last words of the Scroll of Lamentations. We must seek, we must pray for, we must ask for the renewal of this relationship, and for a regeneration, for a renewal of our days as of old. This, in a nutshell, this standing on one foot, is the core of Jewish theology. This is who we are. Now, I hate, Mel, I'll be with you in a moment. I hate to express this in stark terms, but we have to be mindful of this. We have to understand this. We are not in the business of selling illusions. We are not in the business of escapism. We are not in the business of trying to generate faith in that which at the end of the day we know to be unbelievable or inconsistent with everything we've experienced. Our faith, our hope, our mission must be sober. They must be anchored in reality. And our free will must give rise to that faith. It must give rise to this faith, to this purpose, to this mission, not in the context of our knowing everything will be okay, but in the context of our doubt. Our doubt. We don't know. Where does faith enter into our lives? Where does mission and hope enter into our lives? When we don't know. Bless you. When we don't know. This is the Bible's gift to us. This is the gift of Eicha, because Eicha is the core of this lesson for us. And this is what it means to take loss seriously. To understand its reality in our lives. It is profound, and this is why we have survived through the ages. We have offered a truth that others have rejected. It's not hopeless. It does not mean that we give up on our mission to repair the world. It does not mean that we decide that whatever we do doesn't matter. It is not nihilism. It is not existentialism. It is not cynicism. It's real. And I felt that as we conclude and wrap up and tie the loose ends of the Scroll of Lamentations, as difficult as this is, as challenging as this is, I had to share this with you. We had to talk about this. This is the core of who we are. And we live with it every day. And you see the interaction of rabbinic culture with the biblical text through this. And it is yes, but. Yes, and. Right? And the promises we leave to others. Any questions or comments? Yes, Mel.
Was that last sentence written by the author of Lamentations?
Yes.
Okay.
This is the penultimate verse, right? This is the penultimate verse of Lamentations that's just repeated. The same as Isaiah, the same as Ecclesiastes, the same as Malachi at the end of the 12 minor prophets, right? The rabbis haven't written anything else. They took the penultimate verse and reproduced it in small font at the end. Because they didn't like the way the biblical redactor ended these texts. They thought, wait a minute. We're not going to be able to bear this. Especially those of us who read this daily. It's against our eyes every day. Yes.
Can we envision a God that is compassionate but not omnipotent to sort of solve some of these? I'm thinking about, theodicy and the notion of a God who is both omnipotent and compassionate, and yet, what happens? So I'm just thinking, is it possible to have a God who's compassionate in our conception, but not omnipotent? To get that God off the hook for all the
Is there a
troubles.
way to get God off the hook?
Right.
Is there a way to conceive of God as compassionate but not omnipotent? Is there a way to conceive of such a God? And would this be God? If God weren't omnipotent, if God didn't represent power over everything, would it be God? I mean, would we want to pray to a God that's not omnipotent?
that God's in a lot of trouble.
God is in a lot of trouble. God is in a lot of trouble, and Margie, so are we. So are we. Do we give up? No. But we recognize the issues that surround us. We recognize this. Don't try to justify the impossible to justify. Don't try to explain the inexplicable. And don't try to deny the undeniable. But that does not mean give up. It does not mean lose hope. It does not mean stop in our tracks. It means looking at ourselves and at the world around us with open eyes. And knowing and being able to say when we don't know. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. Yes, Helga.
It brings me to a question for today. I'd like to think that we can teach this even to our kids, because what they are fed is really something very different. And is it any wonder that they get turned off by some of the bubberminces that they get?
You know, it's a fascinating comment, Helga, that we should be teaching this to our children. And that they would connect with this to a far greater degree than they do to the bobbermices that they're being fed. I think that's a wonderful comment. It reminds me of the story of the child who comes back home from Sunday school, from religious school, to his mother's kitchen, for the mother to ask her, so what did you learn in school today? And she said, oh, we learned about the Exodus. And mother asks, well, what did you learn? And the child says to her mother, oh, we learned that the Israeli army came over to Egypt and fought the Egyptians and liberated the Hebrews from Egypt and built a pontoon bridge, and the Air Force bombarded the Egyptians. And the mother looks at her in horror and says, that was what they taught you in religious school? And her child says to her, no, but if I told you what they told us, you would think I was crazy. Right? In other words, the notion I'm going to respond very personally to your question. I read this seriously, really read this, and really started to try to make sense of this as a graduate student in my 20s. I think this requires an adult mind. I don't think that children can fully appreciate what this entails. I think we can teach, I think that the learning here must unfold and evolve through our lives. I think that there is a marked difference among people who have experienced goodness and blessing in their lives and who are invincible, and who are young and who are going to go about their lives, and who sometimes are afflicted and can't even tell they're afflicted because they are going to conquer the world. And other people who have lived and whose insights reflect a different kind of experience. Another verse from the Hebrew Bible we're going to read soon says, Ein chacham keval hanisayon, no one is as wise as the experienced. I don't know to what degree children will fully be able to capture this.
But there are elements of this and of realism that we must be able to introduce to our children. And I think we are not doing as good a job as we might in this regard. And that is a very important insight. Yeah.
So I understand that take us back to you, God, and let us return is not meant in a regressive way.
Right.
But it assumes that we have the wisdom and the strength to do so.
Yes.
In the face of suffering and defeat. It assumes we all must be able to take on this load.
That's right. That's right. In other words, the question is, the comment question is, return to us, O God, Hashivenu elecha Adonai venashuva, return to us, our God, and we shall return. Assumes, the text itself assumes, that not only are we capable of again sensing God's presence in our lives, in the sense of goodness, in the sense of potential, in the sense of ongoing life, in the sense of a future, in the sense of promise, but that we are able to return, that we have it in us to return, that we're able to regenerate, that we're able to live in relationship, that we have the insight, the wisdom, the intelligence to return. We are created with the spark of God. Yes, we have that capacity. In spite of the loss, in spite of the defeat, in spite of the horror that we see around ourselves, the answer is an unequivocal yes. And that's how the rabbis want to end the Scroll of Lamentations. That's what they want us to end with. We have it in us. In other words, yes, the uncertainty. That's the biblical author saying, but I'm not making you a promise. I don't know. I don't know. And the rabbis say, yes, but let's repeat. We have it in us. Right? Anyone else? Thank you for joining me through the Scroll of Lamentations. I hope you can get up. I hope that, thank you. Yeah.